This is Mr. Eugene, and today we're discussing something that sits at the very heart of why men are walking away from relationships, from marriage, from the entire project of building families with women. We're talking about divorce, not the romantic dissolution of incompatible partnerships that the glossy magazines describe, but the brutal, systematic destruction of men's lives, men's finances, men's identities, and men's relationships with their children that modern divorce has become. This isn't a comfortable conversation. It isn't a popular one. And it certainly isn't one you'll hear on mainstream media, in courtrooms, or in the social programs designed to support families through this process. Because the men being destroyed by modern divorce are doing what men have always done, with pain, suffering in silence, going along, rebuilding as best they can, and telling nobody how badly they were damaged in the process. But here's what that silence is costing us. The next generation of young men is watching. They're observing what happened to their fathers, their uncles, their older brothers, their mentors. They're seeing men who did everything right, who worked hard, provided generously, stayed faithful, showed up for their families, get absolutely decimated by a divorce process that punishes them financially, strips them of their children, attacks their identity at its core, and then abandons them without support or sympathy while the world rallies around their ex-wives. And those young men are making a rational decision. They're not playing that game. They're not marrying, they're not having children, they're not building the families that form the foundation of any functioning society. And when you lose that, when you lose the participation of healthy, capable, productive men in the social contract of family formation, you don't just have a relationship problem. You have a civilizational problem. And before we get into this, let me tell you why I'm willing to have this conversation despite knowing it will generate significant backlash. Because we live in a society that does genuinely good work protecting the rights of marginalized and oppressed groups. We recognize when systems are unfair. We mobilize to correct injustice. But we have a profound blind spot when it comes to men, particularly men in and after relationships. And that blind spot is allowing a genuine crisis to unfold in plain sight while everyone looks the other way. Men are suffering. Men are losing everything. Men are dying, literally dying by their own hands because of what modern divorce does to them. And society's response is essentially silence. I'm not willing to be silent about it, so stay with me. Today we're examining how divorce impacts men uniquely and devastatingly, why that impact is reaching crisis levels, and what the consequences are for society when we continue to ignore it. Why divorce hits men differently. Let's start with something fundamental. Divorce hits men differently than it hits women, not marginally differently, catastrophically differently. And understanding why requires understanding the specific values and psychological needs that are central to male identity in ways they simply aren't for women. Men hold three core values in higher regard than almost anything else in their lives: respect, loyalty, and purpose. These aren't abstract concepts, they're the foundation of male identity. They're what men build their sense of self around. They're the pillars that, when intact, allow men to function with confidence, dignity, and stability. And modern divorce systematically destroys all three simultaneously. The destruction of respect. Let's start with respect. When a woman initiates divorce, and women initiate approximately 70 to 80% of divorces, she's making a declaration about the man she married. Whether she intends it this way or not, the message received is unambiguous: you weren't good enough. You didn't perform at sufficient level. You failed at the most fundamental role a man takes on in his life. You failed as husband, as provider, as the man I chose to build my life with. For men, this isn't just painful, it's identity destroying, because male identity is built substantially around competence, around being good enough, around meeting the standards required of the roles we take on. When the woman who knows you most intimately, who has seen you at your best and your worst, who you've given everything to provide for and protect, when she says through her actions that you weren't sufficient, that attacks something so deep in a man's psychology that recovery is measured not in weeks or months, but in years, if it comes at all. And the way this disrespect is delivered compounds the damage. It typically doesn't come as honest conversation about incompatibility or grown differences. It comes as a list of failures, things he didn't do, things he did wrong, ways he fell short. The legal process amplifies this. Building a case for divorce requires constructing a narrative of his inadequacy, his failures, his deficiencies as husband and father. He sits through this process having his entire record as a man picked apart and found wanting. The damage to his sense of self is enormous. The betrayal of loyalty, then there's loyalty. And this is where the damage goes from severe to devastating for many men, because a significant percentage of women who initiate divorce don't do so spontaneously. They do so after having already secured their next option. They already have someone in their orbit, already have a plan B on the table, already have emotional investment, and often more, in another man while still married. You don't need to be particularly cynical to recognize what this means. When a woman moves on to a serious relationship within weeks or months of divorce being finalized, or sometimes before it is, that relationship didn't materialize from nothing after separation. That was in development before she left. She was planning her exit while still in the marriage, while he was still trying to make it work, while he was still operating under the assumption that the commitment they made to each other was being honored. For men, who hold loyalty as one of the highest values a person can demonstrate, this is not just painful. It's a fundamental violation of something they consider almost sacred. The person he trusted most, the person he built his life around, the person he believed had made the same commitment he had. That person was planning her exit, securing her replacement, and maintaining the pretense of marriage while doing so. This betrayal sits in men's psyches for years. It doesn't just hurt the relationship that ended. It damages his ability to trust in future relationships. It creates a deep suspicion that any commitment is temporary, that loyalty is performance rather than principle, that the foundation he thought he was building on was always sand. These aren't irrational responses to an isolated, painful experience. They're reasonable conclusions drawn from devastating evidence. The loss of purpose, and then there's purpose. This is perhaps the most profound and least discussed dimension of what divorce does to men. Because when a man builds a family, when he becomes husband and father, those roles don't just give him emotional satisfaction. They give him his reason for being. They give him the mission that men require to function with direction, drive, and psychological stability. Men without mission don't just feel sad. They feel fundamentally lost. They feel useless, purposeless, like their existence serves no function. And this feeling, the feeling of being useless, of having no mission, is one of the most dangerous psychological states a man can be in. It's not coincidental that men who end their lives prematurely consistently express in the notes they leave and the words they share before that final act that they felt useless, that they felt they had nothing left to contribute, that nobody needed them anymore. Divorce strips men of their mission. Suddenly the role they organize their entire identity around, provider, protector, father, husband, is gone. The children they raised are living somewhere else. The home they built is occupied by someone else. The daily purpose of going to work to support a family has been severed from the family it was meant to support. He's providing financially through child support and alimony, but doing so at distance, without the daily connection that made the providing meaningful. When you combine these three things, the destruction of respect, the betrayal of loyalty, and the loss of purpose, you begin to understand why divorce doesn't just hurt men the way it hurts women. It doesn't leave them sad and ready to rebuild. It attacks the foundational architecture of male identity so comprehensively that many men simply cannot find solid ground to rebuild on. The financial devastation, but the psychological destruction, is only part of the picture, because on top of everything I've described, divorce hits men with financial consequences that are catastrophically disproportionate to any reasonable concept of fairness in a society that claims women are men's equals. Let's be direct about this. We live in a time when women have been told correctly that they're equal to men, that they can do any job men can do, that they should be paid equally, that they deserve equal opportunity in every domain of life. The feminist movement spent 50 years establishing this principle and largely succeeded. Women are educated at higher rates than men. Women enter every profession. Women earn competitive incomes. Women can support themselves. Yet our divorce system was designed in an era when none of this was true, when women were financially dependent by default, when they had no career options or earnings prospects, when expecting a woman to support herself after divorce was genuinely unreasonable. The alimony system made sense in that world. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever in this one. But it persists. A man can be divorced by his wife, a woman who chose to leave, who initiated the dissolution of the marriage, and still find himself paying her a significant percentage of his income for years, sometimes decades, sometimes for the rest of his life or hers, for a marriage that she ended because she wasn't happy enough or found someone she preferred or simply decided she was done. This is economically devastating. It's not just the direct payments, though those are severe enough. It's the complete restructuring of a man's financial life at a moment when he's already psychologically devastated. He's lost his home. He's lost daily access to his children. He's lost his sense of identity and purpose. And on top of all of that, he's now paying a financial penalty, ongoing and forced through legal mechanisms attached to his wages for a decision he didn't make and didn't want. This drives men to financial ruin. It drives men from stable housing to inadequate housing to no housing. It prevents men from rebuilding their financial lives because a significant portion of whatever they earn goes to support the life of a woman who chose to leave them and who often moved on quickly to another man. It creates a situation where men are working, often working enormous hours to maintain earning levels required by divorce settlements, while having none of the family life that made that work feel meaningful. And society watches this happen when it pays attention to it at all and says essentially, that's how the system works. There's no outrage, no movement to reform, no recognition that this financial structure is incompatible with modern reality or basic fairness. The theft of fatherhood, but even financial devastation, doesn't represent the full picture of what divorce does to men. Because the final destruction, the one that breaks men who survived everything else, is the loss of their children. Custody arrangements following divorce in this country remain systematically biased toward mothers, despite decades of research demonstrating that this bias has no scientific foundation. Children do not have better outcomes with mothers than with fathers. Paternal instincts are not weaker or less capable than maternal instincts. Fathers are not less important to child development than mothers. The research is actually quite clear on all of this. Yet courts continue to award primary custody to mothers in the overwhelming majority of contested cases. Fathers are given visitation schedules, weekend visits, alternate holidays, perhaps one weeknight, that reduce them from active daily presence in their children's lives to occasional visitor. They pay child support for children they see a fraction of the time they want to and should be spending with them. And they do this while watching those children be raised primarily by the woman who left the marriage and who, in many cases, harbors significant resentment toward the man she divorced. Which brings us to one of the most quietly devastating aspects of this entire dynamic parental alienation: the systematic undermining of children's relationships with their fathers by mothers who use their primary custody status and daily access to poison those relationships, who tell children their father didn't care, that he was the reason the family fell apart, that he wasn't a good man or a good father, who use the children, who are already confused and hurt by family dissolution, as instruments of continued punishment against the man they left. This is child abuse. It should be recognized and prosecuted as such. What is being done to those children, the deliberate corruption of their relationship with their father, the installation of false narratives about a parent they love and need, the weaponization of their vulnerability for adult emotional purposes, causes genuine psychological harm to those children. And the father watching it happen has essentially no recourse, because the system that already disadvantaged him at every other point in this process continues to disadvantage him here as well. The mental health crisis nobody talks about following all of this, the identity destruction, the financial devastation, the loss of children, the absence of support. Men experience mental health consequences that are severe, pathological, and chronically underaddressed. This isn't ordinary sadness or temporary grief. This is deep, settled, life-altering depression that changes who men are and what they're capable of. Depression that costs them jobs because they can't function. That costs them their remaining housing because they can't afford it once the job is gone. That costs them their remaining relationships because the darkness they're carrying makes sustained connection difficult. And this depression doesn't unfold in a society with adequate support structures for these men. There are extensive social programs for women going through divorce. Social workers, support groups, charitable organizations, legal aid, housing assistance. The support infrastructure for women navigating family dissolution is substantial, because society correctly recognizes that these women are vulnerable and need support. But men, a man coming out of a devastating divorce, psychologically destroyed, financially ruined, separated from his children, is largely invisible to these support systems. He doesn't fit the profile of someone society has agreed to view with sympathy. He's expected to handle it, to be stoic about it, to rebuild quietly and not make a fuss. Society has essentially no infrastructure for the crisis these men are experiencing because it has never collectively decided to see these men as people experiencing a crisis worth addressing. Men don't speak up about this. That's part of the tragedy. Male conditioning, the deeply ingrained belief that expressing pain, asking for help, acknowledging vulnerability are forms of weakness incompatible with masculinity, keeps men silent when they desperately need support. They take the pain inward, they handle it privately. They don't organize, don't advocate for themselves, don't create movements demanding their suffering be acknowledged. And so the suffering continues, invisible and unaddressed, until it becomes visible in the most tragic way possible. In the statistics on male suicide that dwarf female suicide rates, in the addiction crisis that disproportionately destroys men, in the loneliness and isolation that define the lives of too many divorced men who survive the immediate crisis only to find themselves living diminished half-lives on the margins of the families and societies they helped build. What this is doing to society. Here's where this stops being about individual men's suffering, as severe and unjust as that suffering is, and becomes a civilizational problem. We are currently producing approximately 1.7 children per woman in this country. The number considered necessary for population stability is 2.1%. We are below replacement rate, and that number is declining, has been declining consistently for nearly 20 years. In Europe, the decline is steeper. In Asia, steeper still. Across the developed world, birth rates are falling and have been falling for a generation. There are many factors in this decline, but one of the most significant and most consistently ignored in mainstream discussion of the issue is that young men have watched what happened to the generation of men who married before them. They've seen their fathers destroyed by divorce. They've watched competent, loving, hardworking men lose their homes, their savings, their children, their mental health, sometimes their lives, to a process that treated their suffering as irrelevant. They've registered all of this, and they're making a completely rational decision not to participate in the same system. They're not getting married, they're not having children, they're opting out of the entire family formation project because they've correctly identified that the terms are catastrophically unfavorable to them, and the downside risks are severe enough that no reasonable expected value calculation supports participation. And this is entirely rational. That's what makes it so difficult to address through shaming or social pressure. The young men making this choice aren't being irrational or cowardly. They're being clear-eyed about risk in a way that previous generations were culturally pressured not to be. They're looking at the institution of marriage as it currently exists, evaluating the terms honestly, and declining. You can't argue them out of that position without addressing the legitimate concerns driving it. What needs to change society needs to address this. Not for men's sake alone, though that would be sufficient justification given the scale of suffering involved, but for society's sake, because a society without men actively participating in family formation, without fathers present in children's lives, without the social contract of committed partnership between men and women producing and raising the next generation, that society is in serious structural decline. What does addressing it actually require? The no-fault divorce system needs serious reconsideration. The idea that a marriage, a legal contract with enormous financial and social implications, can be dissolved unilaterally by one party without reason or consequence is incoherent. Contracts in every other domain of life carry obligations and accountability. The marriage contract should too, not because divorce should be impossible or even particularly difficult, but because dissolution of this contract should carry some accountability from the initiating party, particularly when that dissolution causes enormous harm to the other party and to children. Alimony in its current form is anachronistic and needs to be reformed. In a society where women have equal earning potential and equal access to career development, permanent spousal support makes no sense. Time-limited support for genuine economic adjustment is defensible. Lifetime financial obligation to a woman who chose to end a marriage in a society that celebrates female independence and capability is not. Custody arrangements need to start from presumption of equality rather than presumption of maternal preference. Shared custody should be the default in the absence of genuine safety concerns. Children need both parents. Research supports this clearly. The system should reflect what research actually demonstrates rather than perpetuating outdated assumptions about maternal superiority. Parental alienation needs to be taken seriously as the child abuse it genuinely is. Courts need to recognize it, name it, and impose real consequences when parents use children to punish former spouses. The harm done to children through this process is real, documented, and serious. The legal system should treat it as such. And society needs to develop support infrastructure for divorced men equivalent to what exists for divorced women. Not instead of, in addition to. Men in crisis deserve support too. Their suffering is real. Their need for help is genuine. Their invisibility to existing support systems is not an accident, but a reflection of cultural assumptions about male strength and self-sufficiency that are killing men who have been taught not to ask for help. Final thoughts, let me be clear about what I'm not saying. I'm not saying women are villains. I'm not saying divorce is always wrong or that women who leave genuinely bad marriages shouldn't leave them. I'm not saying men are perfect or that the system has never been unfair in the other direction. I'm saying that modern divorce as it operates in practice is doing catastrophic, systematic, largely invisible harm to men, that this harm cascades outward to children, to communities, to society as a whole, that young men are rationally opting out of marriage and family formation because of what they've witnessed this system do to men who came before them, and that no society can sustain the trajectory we're on without addressing these problems honestly and substantively. This conversation has been mostly absent from public discourse. Men's suffering in and after divorce is rarely treated as a matter of genuine public concern. The data on male suicide rates, male homelessness, male substance abuse, male loneliness, data that traces directly back in significant portion to the devastation of divorce, doesn't generate the outrage or the policy response it would generate if the numbers were reversed. That needs to change, not because men deserve more consideration than anyone else, but because men deserve the same consideration as anyone else. Because the suffering is real, the scale is enormous, and the consequences for ignoring it are ones that none of us, men or women, left or right, progressive or conservative, actually want to live through. This channel exists because I got tired of watching men suffer, while the conversation that could address that suffering never happens. This is that conversation. And if it makes some people uncomfortable, that's exactly what necessary conversations are supposed to do. Drop a comment. Share your experience of how divorce affected you or men you know. This conversation needs more voices, not fewer. Subscribe because this channel will keep having the conversations nobody else is willing to have about what's actually happening to men in modern society. The crisis is real. The silence around it is killing people. It's time to speak.